George Gissing. In the shadow of the atomic bomb, it is not easy to talk confidently about progress. However, if it can be assumed that we are not going to be blown to pieces in about 10 years' time, there are many reasons, and George Gissing's novels are among them, for thinking that the present age is a good deal better than the last one. If Gissing was still alive, he would be younger than Bernard Shaw, and yet already the London of which he wrote seems almost as distant as that of Dickens. It is the fog-bound, gas-lit London of the 80s, a city of drunken Puritans, where clothes, architecture, and furniture had reached their rock bottom of ugliness, and where it was almost normal for a working-class family of 10 persons to inhabit a single room. On the whole, Gissing does not write of the worst depths of poverty, but one can hardly read his descriptions of lower-middle-class life, so obviously truthful in their dreariness, without feeling that we have improved perceptibly on that black-coated, money-ruled world of only 60 years ago. Everything of Gissing's, except perhaps one or two books written towards the end of his life, contains memorable passages, and anyone who is making his acquaintance for the first time might do worse than start with In the Year of the Jubilee. It was rather a pity, however, to use up paper in reprinting 2 of his minor works when the books by which he ought to be remembered are, and have been, for years completely unprocurable. The Odd Woman, for instance, is about as thoroughly out of print as a book can be. I possess a copy myself, in one of those nasty little red-covered cheap editions that flourished before the 1914 war, but that is the only copy I have ever seen or heard of. New Grub Street, Gissing's masterpiece, I have never succeeded in buying. When I have read it, it has been in soup-stained copies borrowed from public lending libraries. So also with Demos, The Netherworld, and 1 or 2 others. So far as I know, only the private papers of Henry Rycroft, the book on Dickens, and A Life's Morning have been in print at all recently. However, the 2 now reprinted are well worth reading, especially In the Year of the Jubilee, which is the more sordid and therefore the more characteristic. In his introduction, Mr. William Plomer remarks that, generally speaking, Gissing's novels are about money and women, and Miss Meffanwy Evans says something very similar in introducing The Whirlpool. One might, I think, widen the definition and say that Gissing's novels are a protest against the form of self-torture that goes by the name of respectability. Gissing was a bookish, perhaps over-civilized man, in love with classical antiquity, who found himself trapped in a cold, smoky, Protestant country where it was impossible to be comfortable without a thick padding of money between yourself and the outer world. Behind his rage and querulousness there lay a perception that the horrors of life in late Victorian England were largely unnecessary. The grime, the stupidity, the ugliness, the sex-starvation, the furtive debauchery, the vulgarity, the bad manners, the censoriousness, these things were unnecessary, since the Puritanism of which they were a relic no longer upheld the structure of society. People who might, without becoming less efficient, have been reasonably happy, chose instead to be miserable, inventing senseless taboos with which to terrify themselves. Money was a nuisance, not merely because without it you starved. What was more important was that, unless you had quite a lot of it, £300 a year, say, society would not allow you to live gracefully or even peacefully. Women were a nuisance, because even more than men, they were the believers in taboos, still enslaved to respectability even when they had offended against it. Money and women were therefore the two instruments through which society avenged itself on the courageous and the intelligent. Gissing would have liked a little more money for himself and some others, but he was not much interested in what we should now call social justice. He did not admire the working class as such, and he did not believe in democracy. He wanted to speak not for the multitude, but for the exceptional man, the sensitive man, isolated among barbarians. In The Odd Woman, there is not a single major character whose life is not ruined either by having too little money, or by getting it too late in life, or by the pressure of social conventions which are obviously absurd, but which cannot be questioned. An elderly spinster crowns a useless life by taking to drink. A young, pretty girl marries a man old enough to be her father. A struggling schoolmaster puts off marrying his sweetheart until both of them are middle-aged and withered. A good-natured man is nagged to death by his wife. An exceptionally intelligent, spirited man misses his chance to make an adventurous marriage and relapses into futility. In each case, the ultimate reason for the disaster lies in obeying the accepted social code, or in not having enough money to circumvent it. In A Life's Morning, an honest and gifted man meets with ruin and death because it is impossible to walk about a big town with no hat on. His hat is blown out of the window when he is traveling in the train, and as he has not enough money to buy another, he misappropriates some money belonging to his employer, which sets going a series of disasters. This is an interesting example of the changes in outlook that can suddenly make an all-powerful taboo seem ridiculous. Today, if you had somehow contrived to lose your trousers, you would probably embezzle money rather than walk about in your underpants. In the 80s, the necessity would have seemed equally strong in the case of a hat. Even 30 or 40 years ago, indeed, bare-headed men were booed at in the street. Then, for no very clear reason, hatlessness became respectable, and today the particular tragedy described by Gissing, entirely plausible in its context, would be quite impossible. The most impressive of Gissing's books is New Grub Street. To a professional writer, it is also an upsetting and demoralizing book, because it deals, among other things, with that much dreaded occupational disease, sterility. No doubt, the number of writers who suddenly lose the power to write is not large, but it is a calamity that might happen to anybody at any moment, like sexual impotence. Gissing, of course, links it up with his habitual themes: money, the pressure of the social code, and the stupidity of women. Edwin Riordan, a young novelist, he has just deserted a clerkship after having a fluky success with a single novel, marries a charming and apparently intelligent young woman with a small income of her own. Here, and in one or two other places, Gissing makes what now seems the curious remark that it is difficult for an educated man who is not rich to get married. Riordan brings it off, but his less successful friend, who lives in an attic and supports himself by ill-paid tutoring jobs, has to accept celibacy as a matter of course. If he did succeed in finding himself a wife, we are told it could only be an uneducated girl from the slums. Women of refinement and sensibility will not face poverty. And here one notices again the deep difference between that day and our own. Doubtless, Gissing is right in implying all through his books that intelligent women are very rare animals. And if one wants to marry a woman who is intelligent and pretty, then the choice is still further restricted, according to a well-known arithmetical rule. It is like being allowed to choose only among albinos, and left-handed albinos at that. But What comes out in Gissing's treatment of his odious heroine and of certain others among his women is that, at that date, the idea of delicacy, refinement, even intelligence, in the case of a woman, was hardly separable from the idea of superior social status and expensive physical surroundings. The sort of woman whom a writer would want to marry was also the sort of woman who would shirk from living in an attic. When Gissing wrote New Grub Street, that was probably true, and it could, I think, be justly claimed that it is not true today. Almost as soon as Reardon is married, it becomes apparent that his wife is merely a silly snob, the kind of woman in whom artistic tastes are no more than a cover for social competitiveness. In marrying a novelist, she has thought to marry someone who will rapidly become famous and shed reflected glory upon herself. Reardon is a studious, retiring, ineffectual man, a typical Gissing hero. He has been caught up into an expensive, pretentious world in which he knows he will never be able to maintain himself, and his nerve fails almost immediately. His wife, of course, has not the faintest understanding of what is meant by literary creation. There is a terrible passage, terrible, at least, to anyone who earns his living by writing, in which she calculates the number of pages that it would be possible to write in a day, and hence the number of novels that her husband may be expected to produce in a year, with the reflection that really it is not a very laborious profession. Meanwhile, Reardon has been stricken dumb. Day after day he sits at his desk. Nothing happens, nothing comes. Finally, in panic, he manufactures a piece of rubbish. His publisher, because Reardon's previous book had been successful, dubiously accepts it. Thereafter, he is unable to produce anything that even looks as if it might be printable. He is finished. The desolating thing is that if only he could get back to his clerkship and his bachelorhood, he would be all right. The hard-boiled journalist who finally marries Reardon's widow sums him up accurately by saying that he is the kind of man who, if left to himself, would write a fairly good book every 2 years. But, of course, he is not left to himself. He cannot even revert to his old profession, and he cannot simply settle down to live on his wife's money. Public opinion, operating through his wife, harries him into impotence and finally into the grave. Most of the other literary characters in the book are not much more fortunate, and the troubles that beset them are still very much the same today. But at least it is unlikely that the book's central disaster would now happen in quite that way or for quite those reasons. The chances are that Reardon's wife would be less of a fool, and that he would have fewer scruples about walking out on her if she made his life intolerable for him. A woman of rather similar type turns up in The Whirlpool in the person of Alma Fotheringham. By contrast, there are the 3 Miss Frenches in The New Year of the Jubilee, who represent the emerging lower middle class, a class which, according to Gissing, was getting hold of money and power which it was not fitted to use, and who are, quite surprisingly, coarse, rowdy, shrewish, and unmoral. At first sight, Gissing's ladylike and unladylike women seem to be very different and even opposite kinds of animal, and this seems to invalidate his implied condemnation of the female sex in general. The connecting link between them, however, is that all of them are miserably limited in outlook. Even the clever and spirited ones, like Rhoda in The Odd Woman, an interesting early specimen of the new woman, cannot think in terms of generalities and cannot get away from ready-made standards. In his heart, Gissing seems to feel that women are natural inferiors. He wants them to be better educated, but, on the other hand, he does not want them to have freedom, which they are certain to misuse. On the whole, the best women in his books are the self-effacing, home-keeping ones. It is very much to be hoped that a complete edition of Gissing's work will be published when paper becomes more plentiful. There are several of his books that I have never read, because I have never been able to get hold of them, and these unfortunately include Born in Exile, which is said by some people to be his best book. But merely on the strength of New Grub Street, Demos, and The Odd Woman, I am ready to maintain that England has produced very few better novelists. This perhaps sounds like a rash statement until one stops to consider what is meant by a novel. The word novel is commonly used to cover almost any kind of story. The Golden Ass, Anna Karenina, Don Quixote, The Improvisatore, Madame Bovary, King Solomon's Mines, or anything else you like. But it also has a narrower sense, in which it means something hardly existing before the 19th century and flourishing chiefly in Russia and France. A novel, in this sense, is a story which attempts to describe credible human beings, and, without necessarily using the technique of naturalism, to show them acting on everyday motives and not merely undergoing strings of improbable adventures. A true novel, sticking to this definition, will also contain at least two characters, probably more, who are described from the inside and on the same level of probability, which, in effect, rules out novels written in the first person. If one accepts this definition, it becomes apparent that the novel is not an art form in which England has excelled. The writers commonly paraded as great English novelists have a way of turning out either to not be true novelists or not to be Englishmen. Gissing was not a writer of picaresque tales, or burlesques, or comedies, or political tracts. He was interested in individual human beings, and the fact that he can deal sympathetically with several different sets of motives and make a credible story out of the collision between them makes him exceptional among English writers. Certainly, there is not much of what is usually called beauty, not much lyricism, in the situations and characters that he chooses to imagine, and still less in the texture of his writing. His prose, indeed, is often disgusting. Here are a couple of samples. Not with impunity could her thought accustom itself to stray in regions forbidden, how firm soever her resolve to hold bodily aloof. The Whirlpool. The ineptitude of uneducated English women in all that relates to their attire is a fact that it boots not to enlarge upon. In the year of the Jubilee. However, he does not commit the faults that really matter. It is always clear what he means. He never writes for effect. He knows how to keep the balance between recit and dialogue, and how to make dialogue sound probable while not contrasting too sharply with the prose that surrounds it. A much more serious fault than his inelegant manner of writing is the smallness of his range of experience. He is only acquainted with a few strata of society, and, in spite of his vivid understanding of the pressure of circumstance on character, does not seem to have much grasp of political or economic forces. In a mild way, his outlook is reactionary, from lack of foresight rather than from ill will. Having been obliged to live among them, he regarded the working class as savages, and in saying so, he was merely being intellectually honest. He did not see that they were capable of becoming civilized if given slightly better opportunities. But, after all, What one demands from a novelist is not prophecy, and part of the charm of Gissing is that he belongs so unmistakably to his own time, although his time treated him badly. The English writer nearest to Gissing always seems to me to be his contemporary, or near contemporary, Mark Rutherford. If one simply tabulates their outstanding qualities, the two men appear to be very different. Mark Rutherford was a less prolific writer than Gissing. He was less definitely a novelist. He wrote much better prose. His books belong less recognizably to any particular time, and he was, in outlook, a social reformer, and, above all, a Puritan. Yet there is a sort of haunting resemblance, probably explained by the fact that both men lack that curse of English writers, a sense of humor. A certain low-spiritedness, an air of loneliness, is common to both of them. There are, of course, funny passages in Gissing's books, but he is not chiefly concerned with getting a laugh. Above all, he has no impulse towards burlesque. He treats all his major characters more or less seriously, and with at least an attempt at sympathy. Any novel will inevitably contain minor characters who are mere grotesques, or who are observed in a purely hostile spirit, but there is such a thing as impartiality, and Gissing is more capable of it than the great majority of English writers. It is a point in his favour that he had no very strong moral purpose. He had, of course, a deep loathing of the ugliness, emptiness, and cruelty of the society he lived in, but he was concerned to describe it rather than to change it. There is usually no one in his books who can be pointed to as the villain, and even when there is a villain, he is not punished. In his treatment of sexual matters, Gissing is surprisingly frank, considering the time at which he was writing. It is not that he writes pornography or expresses approval of sexual promiscuity, but simply that he is willing to face the facts. The unwritten law of English fiction, the law that the hero, as well as the heroine of a novel, should be virgin when married, is disregarded in his books, almost for the first time since Fielding. Like most English writers subsequent to the mid-19th century, Gissing could not imagine any desirable destiny other than being a writer or a gentleman of leisure. The dichotomy between the intellectual and the lowbrow already existed, and a person capable of writing a serious novel could no longer picture himself as fully satisfied with the life of a businessman, or a soldier, or a politician, or what-not. Gissing did not, at least consciously, even want to be the kind of writer that he was. His ideal, a rather melancholy one, was to have a moderate private income and live in a small, comfortable house in the country, preferably unmarried, where he could wallow in books, especially the Greek and Latin classics. He might perhaps have realized this ideal if he had not managed to get himself into prison immediately after winning an Oxford scholarship. As it was, he spent his life in what appeared to him to be hack work, and when he had at last reached the point where he could stop writing against the clock, he died almost immediately, aged only about 45. His death, described by H.G. Wells in his Experiment in Autobiography, was of a piece with his life. The 20 novels, or thereabouts, that he produced between 1880 and 1900 were, so to speak, sweated out of him during his struggle towards a leisure which he never enjoyed and which he might not have used to good advantage if he had had it. For it is difficult to believe that his temperament really fitted him for a life of scholarly research. Perhaps the natural pull of his gifts would, in any case, have drawn him towards novel writing sooner or later. If not, we must be thankful for the piece of youthful folly which turned him aside from a comfortable middle-class career and forced him to become the chronicler of vulgarity, squalor, and failure.